Hello, this pod is on conventions of narrative and genre. So far we've been talking about story structures, but equally important to narrative types are genre categories, where the blending of visual and narrative styles comes together to create categories of films that appear related. Many of the classic genres such as westerns, horror and science fiction emerged from literature and evolved into cinematic form over the course of the 20th century. Other genres, such as the musical, came from vaudeville and theatrical performances, whereas the gangster film, according to Barson and Monaghan, was born and bred in the cinema. They argue that cultural conditions inspire artists to tell certain kinds of stories, and audiences to respond to them. The nature of those narratives motivates certain technical and aesthetic approaches, and eventually the accumulation of like-minded movies is detected, labelled, studied and explicated by cinema scholars. Film scholar Christian Metz proposed a theory that a genre passes through a series of 4 developmental phases: experimental, classic, parody and deconstruction. The first or experimental phase is where the conventions began to be formalised. An example is Nosferatu, made in 1922, that introduced the vampire or horror film genre. This period was influenced by the German Expressionist movement, which had an impact not only on horror but also film noir. I'll return to that later. The second phase, according to Metz, is where a series of films establish the narrative conventions and visual styles of a genre to a point where they become regarded as the classics. And those films become seen as the ones that seem to define the genre. The film Dracula, made in 1931, directed by Todd Browning, starring Bela Lugosi, is where we see established the conventions of lighting, staging, character and performance styles. They can seem laughable to contemporary audiences today, which partly explains the next phase, or parody phase, where these genres are mimicked or mocked. The last phase Metz describes is deconstruction, where films take generic elements and merge them into various subgenres. For example, Scream, which merged the genres teen movie and horror together. But there are likely to be other categories or variations on the theme of genre, such as the homage. One of Tim Burton's films stars Johnny Depp, depicting the life and films of Ed Wood, voted Hollywood's worst director in 1980, but who nevertheless had a love of genre films and performers such as Bela Lugosi, the original Dracula. He made a series of horror, science fiction and cowboy genre films in the 1950s that were laughable. Nevertheless, it could be argued that the film is Burton's homage to Wood's love of genre films, and the film is regarded as a visual masterpiece emulating the classic Dracula era of horror with noir lighting and production design. But it's also worth considering how both genres of horror and film noir were heavily influenced by historical conditions. We've seen that German Expressionism was a modernist art movement that developed before and after World War I. One argument to explain its appeal was that economics were a factor in theatre production, and that dramatic effects could be achieved quite cheaply with graphic lighting and painting of sets, designed in stark, contrasting black and white. Another was that the imagery of the time became even more emotionally intense after World War I, in response to the horrors of that war. It resulted in strikingly graphic images that often expressed intense emotional and psychological states. In this period after World War I, many filmmakers, writers and producers fled Germany and Europe, ending up in Hollywood, where many Hollywood directors admired their work. As a result, the graphic black and white, high contrast lighting styles were often adopted in both horror and the film noir genre. Film noir was characterised by tales of hard-boiled detectives, solving mysteries, femme fatale immersed in intrigue, and depictions of urban life as alienated and morally questionable. The influence of this genre continues to this day. Other genre categories include science fiction, romantic comedy, the musical, and variations upon these themes, including hybrid genres. Whilst genre modes or narrative structures may create predictability and certainty for studios when raising finances to produce films and for film marketing, it can also lead to boredom. Hence the need for originality, experimentation, exploration of alternate ideas and approaches. Some alternative narrative structures to Hollywood and classical narrative include the following. The Kisho Tenketsu, where it is argued the plot diverts towards a surprise or twist to the story, rather than being driven by conflict. Some examples are Rashomon and Inception. And the Robleto, which takes a more circular path. You can read more about these alternate narrative ideas at the link below.